Good evening. Oh, come on. We got Bill Brandt here tonight. Good evening. And welcome to our final program of 2021. My name is Jacob Begard, and I serve as Program Manager of the Common Ground Initiative here in the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center and our good partners over at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum and Library, Gleaves Whitney and Brooke Clement, thank you so much for being with us tonight, whether you're in person or with us on Zoom. If you're joining us in person, we ask that you keep your mask on while indoors if you're not eating and drinking, per the university's policy. In typical fashion, we'll begin tonight with a leadership minute from a student in our Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. Then the executive director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and our good friend Gleaves Whitney will introduce this evening's fan favorite speaker, H.W. Brands. Bill will have a few remarks, and then following his remarks, Gleaves will join him for a short discussion before we open to a live Q&A audience. And then if you're anything like me, and you're currently realizing that we're halfway through December already, I do have some good news for you. Bill will be signing copies of Our First Civil War outside after the program, so please grab your copy if you haven't done so already. They will be available for sale after the program as well. And then a quick housekeeping note, nominations and applications for the 2022-2023 cohort of the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy are now open. So if you know a student leader, or if you yourself are a student leader, we encourage you to submit nominations or your application today. More information can be found on the Hauenstein Center's website. Speaking of student leaders, I'd now like to welcome our next speaker to the podium, Adam Prielip. Adam is a junior and a first-year in the Adam is a junior and a first-year student in the Cook Leadership Academy, and he's majoring in political science with a minor in public administration and history. Please join me in welcoming Adam to the stage.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Adam Prielip, and I'm a Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidate. What leadership means to me is resilience. A week before I came to Grand Valley, a little more than 2 years ago, my grandmother died. A relationship I had been in for 4 years ended, and when I needed them the most, the people who I thought were my friends turned their back on me. This was probably one of the lowest moments in my life. I was sad, angry, and felt betrayed. The night before I left for Grand Valley, I remember sitting in my backyard, watching the sunset. I was thinking and praying. I was angry and confused. I thought about how I could let the events that transpired make me bitter and be an understandable justification to shut myself down and shut myself off from the world. Deeper inside me, though, I found resilience, or perhaps a better word for it is stubbornness, and I refused to let that awful week define my life and define my first week of college. When I came to Grand Valley, I threw myself into the community. If I remember correctly, in my first week, I joined 10 different clubs that I stayed in all through my first semester. I made new friends. I attended my classes religiously and participated in them. The relationships I built with my friends, teachers, and this community were strong and vibrant. When I got bored, I went for walks and introduced myself to people. There was this courage and this confidence that I found in myself that Grand Valley helped me discover. I was hurt, don't get me wrong, but Grand Valley helped me heal and grow into a better person. Then my freshman year, the pandemic came, and my new relationships and our community was tested. When quarantine was over, I came back the following fall. The campus may have felt emptier than it had previously, but my community was stronger than ever. The friendships that I built here withstood the pandemic because the friendships and connections that you make as a Laker last for a lifetime. Leadership is resilience, and sharing that resilience with your community, and being an active part of your community. Leadership is having the will to go on and not being defined by your downfalls, but how you got back up and grew from them. By simply showing that resilience, and when I walk into the Hauenstein Center and the Cook Leadership Academy, I see a room full of resilient leaders. Today, I encourage all of you to share and show your resilience with those around you and inspire your community to carry on and do better. My name is Adam Prielip, and I am a leader. Thank you.
Adam, that was really a remarkable testimony. I usually just say thanks, you do us proud, but I want to say something. Ralph Hauenstein had resilience, and since you're at a place that bears his name, let me tell you a story about Ralph. When he was in World War II, in the early stages of the war, and this was before the United States even got into the war formally, but we had troops in Iceland, so the British troops could go back home. And he had some terrible experiences in Iceland, searing emotional experiences that you can't even imagine. He saw things. This kid from the Midwest, from West Michigan, saw one of his soldiers try to shoot General Bonesteel through a Quonset hut. And when he failed, he turned the gun on his own head. Ralph was standing there trying to get the situation under control. Seared by that. Never seen anything. Kid from Grand Rapids, he'd never seen anything like that in his life. He told me, Ralph and I had lunch every Wednesday, and every Saturday morning we would go to Forest Hills Foods and we'd have a cup of coffee, and he told me stories. Ralph told me that he saw things that he never thought he could get over again. He thought, remember, we had not declared war yet. He thought, why am I here? And he stuck with it, and he dug deep and got the resources from deep down that he needed, his own character and his church and his family, and then his band of brothers. And he stuck it out. And he had many other searing experiences in World War II, and he came out stronger. But I knew that he paid a price. And his resilience, he had to work through his own post-traumatic stress, year after year after year. So when you have that kind of strength, you've already been tested. I'm just here to tell you that it just, it gives you an inner strength that you can face more and more and more and be a shining example for your peers. And it's certainly inspiring for me. So thank you for the great story, and it made me think so much of Ralph, and I appreciate that. It's great to be back at the Hauenstein Center on the stage with the images of Ralph, and of course with Jerry and Betty as well, in my new capacity over at the Ford Foundation. We've always had a strong relationship between these two institutions. One of the defining features of the two institutions is that we've always had tonight's speaker back. We've always had Bill come back. Started going back to 2003. We started having Bill, 2004, come in to do programs. And boy, in some of the early days, we had you here for a week one time. And Bill became a fixture. And we used to joke, we'd say, we're going to give him tenure on the faculty up here. But so many times he came up that I keep telling the tenure committee, give the guy tenure, and they won't do it. So I said, I just made an executive decision. We're going to emeritize him. He keeps coming. He's a faithful fan of Ralph's and Jerry and Betty Ford, and he's come back. He's cultivated a wonderful audience, as so many people here know. So it's really great to have Bill back. Now, I've introduced Bill in a number of ways. I've introduced him using sort of the standard bio that you have at the University of Texas. And we was at Texas A&M. I had the standard bio. And then with the Pulitzer Prize finalist books, I had the standard biography from his publisher. I've even introduced Bill using his poetry, because he's a haiku poet. He's a haiku poet of considerable talent. You ought to try reading some of them. And he's got a lot of wit. This is where his wicked wit actually comes through. It's a lot of irony, and there are a lot of fun things in that haiku poetry. You read his haiku poetry, it's the whole history of the United States that he's laying out in haiku. So I've introduced him in every which way. But tonight, I have found a new way to introduce Bill. This must be almost 2 decades now. I decided to go to Bill's students, as recorded in Rate My Professors. And we're going to see what his students say about him, because this will be the truth serum. We're going to really find out what Bill Brands, H.W. Brands, is like, beyond the degrees from Stanford and University of Texas, beyond the accolades in the books, this is what Bill Brands really is. Okay, so you ready for this? Okay. Are you ready, Bill? He tells me he's never gone to Rate My Professor. He has never heard these. This has not been rehearsed, ladies and gentlemen. He has never heard what his students have said about him. So here's what we got. First student I came across. Professor Brands is a gem, hands down one of my favorite professors because every lecture feels like story time. Another student. When people ask me why the University of Texas is such an elite university, I tell them it's because they have professors like H.W. Brands. His class seriously changed my life. As a student who always hated history, a third person writes, Brands is a breath of fresh air. Now I love history. Super chill classes. You just sit there and as if you're watching a movie. Fourth student says, Dr. Brands is extremely intelligent and tells funny stories. He knows everything about history, like who someone's mom was and what kind of skull you're looking at. I'd love to know what he was listening to that day. Another student. He knows when you're trying and when you're faking it. And then here's one, just a couple more. He's so sweet and approachable. He's also hilarious, which makes his classes great stress relievers. After taking History 315, I didn't have to go to my therapist for a long time. Finally, this comment stands above all the others. This young lady wrote, I go to all his lectures because he is hot. Ladies and gentlemen, I give to you the hot Bill Brands.
Thank you, Gleaves. Thank you for that very warm introduction. Now, I don't want you to get too comfortable when you sit down because I'm going to say that as Gleaves has pointed out, I've been coming to Grand Valley for now nearly 2 decades. And I've met many of you, and I count many of you as friends, even if we only see each other once a year or so. But more than anything, the thing that brings me back is Gleaves Whitney. And I feel as though Gleaves and I have been having an almost 20-year running conversation on the subjects that interest us most. And it sort of starts with the presidency, the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, and history. But it goes way beyond that, because Gleaves is a student of philosophy. He is one of the best read and most thoughtful people I know in the academic world or beyond. And last evening, when Gleaves came to pick me up at the airport, before we even got to the car, the conversation simply resumed, and it felt as though there hadn't been a break in it. So, really, Gleaves, I'd like you to come back up, and let's just start our conversation here. And don't worry, I'll say more. It's not as though I'm relinquishing my floor time. But I enjoy the conversation, and let's see if the audience will enjoy it too.
I think that's a great idea. Okay, we're going to be talking about this latest book of yours, Our First Civil War, about the Patriots and Loyalists in the American Revolution. Of course, the Patriots being those who, adhered to sort of the revolutionary principle of George Washington, Benjamin Franklin after they had turned, and then the Loyalists being loyal to King George III, Parliament, and the English way. So, Bill, let's start off with why you would write a book like this. What made you write this in the first place, especially after your Franklin book, Pulitzer Prize finalist, Bill wrote a marvelous book on Benjamin Franklin, and there must have been a seed in that book for this one.
There definitely was. So I wrote this long book on Benjamin Franklin. I spent a lot of time studying Benjamin Franklin. I thought that I had mastered what can be mastered by the historian on Benjamin Franklin. But there was still a sneaking suspicion in the back of my mind that I might have been hoodwinked by Franklin. And this relates to an aspect of Franklin's public career that overlapped closely with his private life, and it had to do with his relationship with his son. And his relationship with his son was complicated by the fact that his son was illegitimate. And Franklin took custody of young William from the moment he was born. In fact, historians to this day have not been able to figure out who William Franklin's mother was. They've always known the father was Benjamin Franklin because he said, okay, this is my son. But the upbringing of William Franklin was complicated by this sort of stepchild situations that stepfamilies encounter. He was raised by Benjamin Franklin's wife, but William Franklin's mother was another woman. And this was one of those moments in history where I wished I could have been a fly on the wall. So just very briefly, this is a minor digression, but since you keep inviting me back, apparently you put up with this kind of thing, because I do this all the time. Benjamin Franklin was engaged to marry Deborah Reed. And so the plans were moving ahead when Benjamin Franklin discovered, and then had to break the news to Debbie, that he, Benjamin Franklin, was about to become the father of a child by another woman. And so I always wonder, in fact, sometimes I ask my students to do this historical exercise. Imagine that they were listening when Ben Franklin says to Debbie, honey, I got something I got to tell you. It's good news and bad news. You're going to be a mother. Well, actually, you're going to be a stepmother. I'm going to be a father. And so, I mean, obviously, Ben had been cheating on Debbie. And beyond that, he's asking her to take in as her child, stepchild, this son that Benjamin Franklin is having by this other woman. Now, he managed to pull it off. I don't know what her first reaction was. Did she slap him in the face? Did she say, I never want to see you again? We don't know. The record is silent on this, but we know how it turned out. So, one of the things I suggest to my students is that at that moment, Benjamin Franklin demonstrated the diplomatic skills that would serve his country very well amid the American Revolution. But carrying this forward, Benjamin Franklin became one of the most famous of the Patriots. In fact, I pose the question to my students. I'll pose it to you. You can guess what the answer is in the context I'm giving it. But if there had never been an American Revolution, which of the people we identify as the Founding Fathers can we be sure that we, any of us today, would have heard of? Would you have heard of George Washington? Not necessarily. George Washington was an important figure in Virginia life, in Virginia politics, but the reason he became famous was that he was commanding general of the Continental Army. No revolution, no Continental Army, no fame for George Washington. Would you have heard of Thomas Jefferson? Thomas Jefferson was renowned for being the first and principal author of the Declaration of Independence. No American Revolution, no Declaration of Independence, no Tom Jefferson that you've ever heard of. The only one we know we would have heard of is Benjamin Franklin, because Benjamin Franklin was world famous before the American Revolution. So anyway, he becomes one of the stalwarts of the Patriot movement, of the independence movement. But his son William grew up to become the royally appointed governor of New Jersey, a position that he held in the mid-1770s, when people like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and others were opting for independence. And William Franklin decided to stick with the king, to honor the oath of office that he had taken to uphold British law. And as a result of this divergence in their views, Ben Franklin becoming patriot, a rebel, William Franklin remaining a loyalist, they had a falling out amid the American Revolutionary War, which was not surprising. Franklin fell out with lots of people that he had known and actually had close relationships before the war, but who sided with the British. Now, many of those people were actually British themselves. Franklin had spent much of the 2 decades before the Revolutionary War living in London. And when he became a rebel, then he no longer wrote to them. Actually, some of them, in some cases, they still wrote. In other cases, he said, we just can't carry this forward anymore. The Patriots, their side, won the war, and Franklin was able and willing to make amends with nearly all of those English friends, and actually American friends, who were loyalists, that he had fallen out with. But the one that he couldn't or wouldn't make up with was his son. And I've thought about this. I have 3 children. They're all adults now. And for the life of me, I cannot imagine anything that they would do, especially anything based in politics, for heaven's sakes, that would cause me to say, you're no longer part of my family. I don't want you part of my life. I just can't imagine that. And so the fact that I can't imagine it indicates that there's something I just don't exactly get about Benjamin Franklin. I can see what he's doing. I can hear the words that he's saying in justifying his actions, but I'm not quite fathoming the emotional content of those. So basically, in answer to your question, to take a second whack at this sort of thing, I knew this story from writing about it in my biography of Benjamin Franklin, but in this version, I tell much more of William Franklin's side. So the format of the book is I identify, I say 8 to 10, and 8 to 10 individuals who are going to become either patriots or loyalists. And it's sort of an approximation because I've got some relatively minor figures that just kind of wander in. So it's not, there are about 6 or 7 full-blown storylines that run through. And so I make much more of the situation of William Franklin than I did in my book on Benjamin Franklin. And I wanted to get back at this, and part of it was, well, I won't say that this late date, I really thought I was going to figure Franklin out. And I came away as puzzled on that one score as I had been before. And I'm not exactly going to say that I gained a greater appreciation for the position of William Franklin, except I will say that I had a greater understanding of what motivated people like that. But from that, I then sort of expanded outward to pose a question that I actually introduced at the beginning of the book. And the question as I pose it is, what causes a person to forsake his country and take arms against it? Now, that's really the decision that everybody in the American colonies at the time, that's a decision they had to make. Do you make that choice or not? But I teach young people at the University of Texas, and the large majority of the people that I teach, the students that I teach, are first-year students. So they are 18 years old. They are just embarking on adult life, and since the early 1970s, we lowered the voting age to 18, their life as citizens, where they get to go out and vote. And they make decisions, they contribute to decisions that we all have to live by. This is the nature of democracy. And I try to impress upon them the great responsibility that is involved in that. And so I ask them, and I ask you right now, could you imagine anything that is either happening now or that might happen in the next, 5 or 10 years that would cause you to seriously reconsider your patriotic allegiance? Because what people like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, all the other patriots did was they basically said that this country that I was born in, this country that I grew up in, this country that allowed me the life that I have, is no longer enough. It's no longer satisfactory. I am so dissatisfied with this country that I'm going to throw it out and attach my allegiance to another country. So this was the challenge that was posed to basically, as I say, everybody in the American colonies in the mid-1770s. And I just ask you, could you imagine anything like that? Now, I'm going to guess that if you're like other groups that I've posed the question to, for most of the answer is no. But I have to say that political events of the last dozen years or so have caused me to rethink whether this issue might ever come up. And there are various sort of straws in the wind that come up every now and then. And sometime, it was either in late summer, no, it was sometime early in the fall, there was a survey reported that had asked people if they could entertain the possibility that the conservative states in the United States might somehow separate themselves from the liberal states in the United States. Now, it didn't go into the mechanics, the logistics of how this would happen. It just said, would you ever think that this would be something you might consider? And the surprising thing to me, I confess I was shocked when I heard that basically half of the people, half of the respondents said, yeah, I could imagine that. I think the numbers were for Republicans, 50% said yeah, and for Democrats it was something like 46%, so hardly a difference between the two parties. And I thought, that is actually quite remarkable. I'm not sure that I could identify a moment in American history before this where the numbers were so high, except for maybe those critical moments in the, what now I'm calling the other Civil War, the one of the 1860s. But then I go back to the 1770s, where everybody was entertaining this possibility. We don't know what the relative numbers of Patriots and Loyalists were. John Adams, looking back on it from decades later, said that at the beginning of the fight with Britain, he thought that there were maybe a third of the population who were Patriots and a third who were Loyalists. And a third in the middle that hadn't made up their minds. In many cases, probably didn't want to have to make up their minds because this was a difficult decision to make. And for example, in the case of the Franklins, it split the family. So it was kind of thinking about these kinds of issues. You've heard me say, Gleaves, that probably even in our conversation since I got here last evening, that the longer I'm in this business of teaching, and I consider myself primarily a teacher. I started teaching before I started writing. And my writing I consider to be an extension of my classroom. And you're all an extension of my classroom as well. And the longer I'm in this business, the more I'm convinced that the fundamental questions that historians grapple with are questions that go to sort of to values, they go to morality of what is it that makes people do what they do. And it's not morality in the sense of, what do you think is right and what do you think is wrong? I mean, that's involved. But how do you explain that honest, sincere, thoughtful people can come to diametrically opposed positions on some central issues? And in studying the American Patriots and the Loyalists, and I treat them essentially as even-handedly as I can. I don't give any preference to the side that I know is going to win. In fact, one of the points that I don't make it explicitly in the book, although it does inform the way I tell the story. I certainly make it to my students, and that is that if you want to understand history, you have to forget that you know how it turned out. And you have to put yourself back in the moment when, well, as Benjamin Franklin said, upon signing the Declaration of Independence, well, we must hang together, said Franklin, or else we will all hang separately. Mm-hmm. This was a huge step, and there was no reason to have confidence that that side was going to win. And so, as I break down the story of these individuals, I try to make it seem to the reader as though you're there. And you don't know how it's going to turn out, but the people that you're learning about, as often as I can possibly make it, through their own eyes, through their own words, how does the world look to them? And how do they act in the face of this big uncertainty? So These are the kind of questions that prompted me to write this book.
Really good questions that get to the core of human nature, loyalty. You know, Jonathan Haidt and others have studied what our sort of our moral core values are, and loyalty is one of those that liberals and conservatives share. And you tell the poignant story of Benjamin and his son William. By the way, just to follow up real fast, did you find anything, and I gotta say, when you read this book, so probably 2/3 of the book is actually in the words, 3/4 of the book is in the words of the founders themselves. Bill did extensive archival research through the great internet virtual reality that we live in, where we can do a lot of that study. And I apologize for this microphone that's sort of acting up a little bit. But is there any evidence in all of that research that Benjamin now, had second thoughts about William? I mean, as a father.
It's possible after the final meeting that Franklin, it's possible. There's no evidence to prove it. It's possible that Franklin regretted that decision they made. So the final meeting takes place in 1785. Benjamin Franklin has been in Paris from the end of 1776 until 1785. Through 1783, Franklin was America's minister plenipotentiary, so America's ambassador, to the French government. And his first order of business was to persuade the French to ally with the United States and to support the American independence effort. Once that was accomplished, then it was to continue funneling French support in terms of money, soldiers, ships, and war materiel to the United States. Following the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, then Franklin headed up the Peace Commission for the American side. And the negotiations took place in Paris with Franklin's British counterparts. The peace treaty is signed, and Franklin is still there. The Continental Congress back in the United States has not seen fit to recall him. They like the fact that he's been very successful. And Franklin himself is reasonably happy in Paris. His wife, Debbie, has died back home in Philadelphia. He does have a daughter, and he has a couple of grandchildren in Philadelphia, but he's also developed a circle of friends in Paris, and they urge him to stay. By this time, he had developed kidney stones, gout, so it was painful for him simply to move. To travel was almost out of the question. And they said, just stay here. You don't have to travel across the ocean. You don't have to travel across land to get to the ocean. Just stay here and live out your life among your friends. And he was tempted. But finally he decided that he wanted to go back to Philadelphia. He wanted to see his grandchildren. Well, actually, a couple of his grandkids were with him, but he wanted to see the ones he hadn't met, to see his daughter. And on the way, a meeting was arranged that he wasn't expecting. One of his grandsons, William Franklin's son, was with him in Paris. This young man was named William Temple Franklin. And so he was, within the family, he was called Temple. And Temple Franklin, so I explained that William Franklin was Benjamin Franklin's illegitimate son. Temple Franklin was William Franklin's illegitimate son. Temple Franklin had an illegitimate son. So Benjamin Franklin was many things, but he was not a poster child for conventional family values. But anyway, so Temple Franklin was sort of the person caught between his father and his grandfather. And so father and grandfather had to make a decision, whose country are you loyal to? Temple Franklin had to make the same decision, but it was simultaneously, which of your forebears are you loyal to? Do you choose your father or your grandfather? Now, Benjamin Franklin felt abandoned by William. His son had forsaken him. Now, whether Benjamin Franklin should have felt that way is an entirely separate matter, but it's pretty clear that he did feel that way. Temple Franklin, he is in a position where he has to choose between father and grandfather. Benjamin Franklin kind of stacked the deck in a way that made it very difficult for Temple to choose his father and easy for him to choose his grandfather. So he did. And Temple, it was made easier by the fact that if Temple stayed with Benjamin Franklin, he would get a trip to Paris out of this. He would get a European education out of this at his grandfather's expense. If he sided with his father, he might very well go to his prison with his father because his father was about to be imprisoned for being loyal to King George. So that was straightforward enough from Temple's standpoint. But when the war ended, Temple began to work the levers behind his grandfather's back to arrange a reconciliation between his father and his grandfather. And so it was Temple Franklin who wrote to William Franklin, now living in exile in England as a loyalist. And after the war, the British, for whom the loyalists had fought or sided, they just wanted to forget all about the loyalists because the loyalists were reminders of a war they had lost, of a failed effort that cost a lot of money, did damage to British prestige, and didn't wind up succeeding in any way. So William Franklin is living in England, friendless, almost penniless, and he gets these letters from Temple, writing surreptitiously from Paris, saying, "Grandfather wants to reconcile." Grandfather did not want to reconcile. And grandfather did not know that Temple was misrepresenting him to William. And when it became apparent that Benjamin Franklin was going to be going back to America, but the ship was going to stop at Southampton on the coast of England before it proceeded across the Atlantic, Temple wrote a letter to his father saying, "Father, grandfather and I will be in Southampton on this day. And grandfather would like to see you and to make amends." So William reads this, and William was very open to the idea of reconciliation, of putting the family back together. And so William shows up. Now, the meeting takes place at this busy hotel. I mean, it was an inn, they called it then, but basically a hotel. And people are coming and going, and Benjamin Franklin has no idea that his son is going to be there. There are his old British friends who are coming, and he's happy to see them. And then all of a sudden, he sees William. And it didn't take him long to figure out what had happened, that Temple had led William to believe that there was going to be a reconciliation. And so Benjamin Franklin's mood, I can almost say his heart, hardened in that moment. And now I'm inferring this part, that part of him must have felt that now Temple is betraying him too, and that the apple didn't fall far from the tree there. But from Temple's perspective, Temple is this young man, he's about 23 or 4 years old at this point. And he is dearly hoping that his family can be put back together, that he does not have to continue to choose between his grandfather, who has become almost like a second father. Temple has spent a lot more time with his grandfather than with his own father. But of course, William's his father, and so he wants to put these two together. He wants to make the family whole again. And William puts his hand out to Ben. He says, "Father, let's Let bygones be bygones. The war is over. We now can be friends. We can be family again. When I first started writing about Benjamin Franklin back in the 1990s, I realized that something that I make a point of doing when I write about figures in history was going to be difficult to do with Benjamin Franklin. And the point that I make is, don't get too close to your characters. Keep them at arm's length so that you will not be swayed, so you'll not be inclined to take their side of arguments. No, these are, I try to be almost clinical about this. So imagine that these are sort of microbes on a slide. Take this scientific view of this. And for certain figures in history that I've written about, this is not difficult. Lyndon Johnson doesn't give you the warm fuzzies when you're writing about him. He's a striking character. Even Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, from a distance, seems like, oh boy, he'd be a great person to know. He's a very colorful character. But he really was this character that was easier to observe from a distance. Another brief digression. So as I said, I have 3 children. My middle child is my older son. And Hal actually has become a historian. He's a very successful historian. But maybe partly because he saw what his dad did when he was growing up. And he concluded that, well, if the old man can do it, how hard can it be? So he becomes a historian. But when Hal was about 4 years old, he was still in a stroller. At least I could still get him to sit in a stroller when I wanted to go places. And the Texas state capitol was being renovated. So this was in the late 1980s. And all the interior was renovated. And the last thing that remained to be done was for new finish to be put on the Goddess of Liberty, the statue that sits atop the dome. By the way, if you ever are in Texas, they'll be happy to tell you that the dome of the Texas Capitol is taller than the dome of the National Capitol in Washington. Anyway, they don't tell you that the volume is less, but it's taller. Anyway, so it was going to be a really cool operation because to get the statue, the Goddess of Liberty, off the top of the dome, they were going to bring in one of those double-rotored sky crane helicopters. And Hal, like lots of little boys, was thrilled with noisy machines. So I thought, Hal would really like this. So I took him down there, and the helicopter, and they managed to lift it off, and then they flew around a little bit, and they lowered it to the grass of the Capitol grounds. And so I was able to plead, hey, my little boy wants to look at this, to take him up to the front row. And Hal got up there, and he took one look at the Goddess of Liberty and burst into tears. And he was just bawling. And, oh, what's going on here? Well, then I looked at the Goddess of Liberty, and I started crying too. Because it was one of those pieces of statuary that's designed to be viewed from a distance of about 500 feet and an angle of declination of about 45 degrees. So the features are all vastly overdrawn. You remember in the Superman comics, there's Bizarro Superman, the one who has these really grotesque features? Well, that's what the statue looked like. Goddess of Liberty, really? Strange goddess. But I'm reminded of that when I think about, this is going to sound really disrespectful to Theodore Roosevelt, but it's a little like that. Roosevelt was this figure who was much more comfortable viewing from a great distance. But if you get up close, it's sometimes just too much. For Henry Adams would talk about going to lunch at the White House and you come home and you have to wring the Roosevelt out of your clothes. He came at you that way. So all this is by way of saying that I didn't want to get drawn in by Benjamin Franklin. I didn't want to fall for his charm. And so I kept my distance until this moment of the meeting between William Franklin and Benjamin Franklin. And William Franklin has put out his hand and said, Father, let us be family again. As I say, I try to keep my distance from the people I'm writing about, but that moment, I had this overwhelming desire to reach across 2.5 centuries of history and grab Benjamin Franklin by the shoulder and say, take his hand, will you? Take his hand. This is your last chance. But he wouldn't do it. And he didn't do it. And so they parted unreconciled. There's no indication that there was any direct communication between the two until Franklin's death 5 years later. And in fact, Franklin's bitterness persisted beyond his grave. And in his will, he left William almost nothing. And he commented in his will, that the amount I left to my son is no more than he tried to deprive me of by waging war against me. So it was something he just couldn't get over. But the thing is that I guess it's not, that's related to this thing that I can't quite understand. But there was this assumption in Benjamin Franklin that because Benjamin Franklin, had taken a position against the British government, that his son must do so as well. But this was so in contradiction to Franklin's own approach to the world. Franklin was a firm believer that individuals are free to make up their minds, and adults get to choose their own positions. And in his case, he had rebelled against his father, so it was not uncharacteristic for the family for William to say, I'm not following you, Father, I'm going to make up my own mind. So that was just part of him. I don't know. So I won't say I got this part of Franklin wrong, but if there's this part of Franklin that I don't understand, I sometimes wonder, is there other stuff about Franklin that I still don't understand? But this is what historians deal with. We have evidence, and the evidence will take us so far. Beyond that lies conjecture. And if we're going to be historians, we let our readers know what's conjecture. If we don't want to do that, then we become novelists, and we just make up our own version of it. But I haven't gone there yet.
By the way, in Houston, the San Jacinto Monument is 1 foot taller than the Washington Monument. It's a Texas thing. Okay, Bill, that's very poignant. It's heartbreaking, the word you used earlier today. And in the context of Benjamin Franklin's life, and I want to move on to George Washington here pretty soon and his break, because you asked such a profoundly good question. What makes a person break with the mother country? You have this moment, this dramatic moment for Benjamin Franklin when he, as you so beautifully, powerfully put it, he walks into the meeting, a British subject. He comes out of that meeting an American citizen. Would you please explain that?
Yes. Benjamin Franklin recognized what he owed to the British Empire. I said earlier that Franklin was world famous before the American Revolution. And he understood that he had become world famous because he lived in a very enlightened political state and a political culture that valued the things that Benjamin Franklin valued. He was born into a family of very modest means in Boston, one of 15 children, and he had to make his way on the strength of his intelligence. He was smart, of his ambition, of his diligence, of his knack for opening doors for himself. And he succeeded brilliantly. But he succeeded in part because the British allowed that sort of thing to happen. Although, now this is crucial, it was easier for this to happen in the British colonies than it was in Britain itself. I'm occasionally asked, and even when I'm not asked, I ask myself, so is there a modern equivalent of Benjamin Franklin? And my answer is, yeah, probably. And given the fact that the population of the world has grown a lot, there are probably lots of modern equivalents of Benjamin Franklin. But I can guarantee you they're not living in the United States. What made Franklin Franklin was that he was living in what amounted to a frontier society, a society in which institutions had not taken form and shape yet. So he could participate in this kind of thing. So if there is a Benjamin Franklin today, he or she, could be a she today, probably lives in some developing country where institutions don't place such a burden on what individuals can accomplish. Or quite conceivably, I mean, maybe Franklin actually is alive and living in Houston. We've talked about Houston and how, to me, Houston is one of the remarkable stories of modern American life because it is a magnet for immigrants from all over the world, and they really respond to what is Houston's informal motto. And Houstonians say to people who come to Houston, come on to Houston. We won't help you, but we won't get in your way. And so Franklin would have thrived under those circumstances. But so now this does happen. So I digress 2 or 3 degrees. What was the original question?
Well, it's about Franklin going into a meeting.
Ah, yes. So the critical moment in Franklin's career, the moment when he becomes a patriot, when he becomes a rebel. Franklin was an enthusiast of the British Empire because he recognized it allowed him to accomplish what he accomplished. And he had a vision for the British Empire. And the vision was that the British in Britain would acknowledge that their American cousins were, and should be, their full equals. Franklin was America's first demographer, person to study changes in population growth and the like. And he calculated, and this was no easy calculation, some of it was simply estimation, that the American population, the population of the American colonies was doubling every generation. This was a growth rate far faster than the growth in the population in England. And by this reckoning, the population of Britain in North America would outstrip the population of Britain on the eastern side of the Atlantic within a few more generations. And if the British were enlightened enough, and even enlightened in their own self-interest, they would recognize if they would simply allow Americans to participate in the same institutions and political practices that the British enjoyed practiced in England, then there might be this glorious future of an empire founded on 2 roughly equal pillars, one on the east side of the Atlantic, the other on the western side of the Atlantic. And he held to this view, even after troubles began to develop between the colonies and the mother country. Franklin, in some ways, was the last one on board of the independence movement, in some ways, because Franklin was resisting independence to the very end, well, almost to the very end, to a moment in January 1774. So this is after the Stamp Act, this is after the Townsend Duties, this is after the Boston Massacre, this is after the Boston Tea Party. In fact, it's in the wake of the Boston Tea Party that Franklin is summoned to a building called the Cockpit. It was on the site where they actually used to have fights among the fighting cocks, the roosters. And it was still sort of like that because it was where the British Privy Council met, and they sat in their august chairs on the floor with the witness essentially in the dock before them, standing there before them. And there's a gallery which ringed the building at the top, and everybody sort of looks down and they can hoot and holler and do all sorts of stuff. And Franklin is brought in and made to answer for the sins, and most recently the crime of the vandalism, the destruction of millions of dollars worth of tea. And everything that the British ruling elite held against the American insurgents, the rabble, the Boston mob, all the people who engaged in violent protests against the Stamp Act, everything that had been building up for a decade. All of this is heaped upon Franklin. And Franklin is compelled simply to stand there and listen. As the king's solicitor general, a man named Alexander Wedderburn, who was essentially sort of a hired gun for this occasion. And he rakes Franklin up one side and down the other. He calls him a traitor, a liar, a thief, no gentleman, all this stuff. And Franklin, as he stands there listening to this, again, now this part is conjecture, but I'm fairly confident in this, that Franklin realizes that his dream for holding the empire together is a waste of time. That with these sorts of people running the British government, there is no hope. And Franklin was confident enough of his own abilities and of his own accomplishments to measure himself against Alexander Wedderburn, this hitman, against the other lords of the Privy Council, against the people who were making decisions for Britain, and say, compared to me, these people are corrupt, they're ignorant, they are short-sighted. And if that's the people that I would have to live with, if I stayed an Englishman, then I don't want to be an Englishman. And I exaggerate a little bit when I say that Franklin walked into that meeting, an Englishman, and walked out an American. And so in Franklin's case, the basis of his decision to become a patriot was as much personal as it was political. You've heard me say this, but I imagine that history takes place in two different realms. One is the realm of big history. This is a history of what governments do. It's history of armies marching across battlefields, and industrial revolutions playing out, and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and the emergence of Christianity, and sort of all the big picture stuff you think of when you think about history over the centuries. That's big history. And then there's little history. And little history is what happens to individuals. It's what you ate for breakfast. It's how you felt about your wife or your cousin or whatever this morning. It's why you decided to come to this lecture this evening. You know, it's the warp and woof of private life. And I probably take this position more strongly than some people who write history, who are better at doing sort of the broad brush stuff than I am. There's a new book out. I can't remember the name of it, but it's something like, it's the history, it's sort of all of history from 10 million years ago or something like that. And if you're going to cover that much ground, you have to paint sort of broadly. I find myself, both in my own reading of history, and then that translates into my writing of history, to want to know what it felt like, what it looked like, what it sounded like to people who were there. I want to get inside the heads of the people who were making these decisions. What did it look like to them? And in this case, and Benjamin Franklin's case is unique in its own way, but everybody else that I describe in this book, and I would posit to you, everybody who had to make this decision, do you stick with your country, Britain, or do you side for this new country, America? In every case, there is the big history, and then there's the little history. And I've been asked, I was just asked yesterday in an interview, so is there any generalization you can make about the people who became patriots? And then presumably a counterpart generalization you can make about the people who remained loyalists. And I say, maybe a little bit. Maybe the loyalists were more of what we would call conservative, in the sense of being willing to stick with the existing status quo. But I say, the thing that overwhelms that, I don't have a whole lot of confidence in that generalization. It's more important for me to know the peculiar circumstances, the idiosyncrasies of an individual. Because I think that's what, in Franklin's case, that's what nudged him over the top. It became personal. They're not letting me, Benjamin Franklin, be a fully fledged, first-class Englishman. And I've done way more than any of these people. I'm more talented than any of these people. And they still look down on me, simply because I was born in America. And that's not right. So they won't let me be an Englishman, therefore I must be an American. And at the heart of all of this, and this is sort of what comes back to that poll question that I asked, or I reported the results on, where can you imagine the United States would sift out into conservative states and liberal states? For that to happen, it seems to me that a large number of people will have to say, I think of myself as a conservative first and an American second. or a liberal first and an American second. So that re-identification has to take place, because for those people who did become patriots, I'll repeat myself here, they were born English men and women, and they died Americans. The ones who remained loyalists, they were born English men and women, and they died English men and women. So the re-identification did not take place for everybody. But for those who did, once they started thinking of themselves as different than they had been before, then from that, the other stuff follows, I'm not going to say inevitably, but it follows fairly predictably. In the case of George Washington. I'm not going to go into detail of George Washington, but he has his own story. And to put it very succinctly, George Washington was a better military officer than anybody he had ever met in the British Army. And like Franklin, he recognized that that didn't matter to the people who made decisions in the British government. He would never achieve the respect he thought he deserved simply because he had been born in America. And people who were far less qualified than he was would have the commanding positions in the British military establishment, and he wouldn't. And I'm not going to say that he said, okay, that country doesn't respect me, doesn't reward me, therefore I'm going to create a country of my own. But there's some of that there. Now, we were talking about David Crockett, a hero of the Texas Revolution who died at the Alamo. In the case of Crockett, Crockett went to Texas because he had lost his campaign for re-election to Congress in Tennessee. And he went to Texas when this revolution of the Texans against the Mexican government had already broken out, and there was every reason to believe that Texas was going to become the next state of the United States. So when he went to the Alamo, he was essentially beginning his campaign to be one of the first senators from Texas. So if you're not getting what you want in the country in which you're living, create a new country. That's part of it. And on the way out of Tennessee, he said, well, you all can go to hell. I'm going to Texas. Which brings to mind, what Phil Sheridan said. And Phil Sheridan, the Union general during the Civil War, who was posted to Texas after the war was over. And he said, if I owned hell and Texas, I would rent out Texas and live in hell. And I speak as someone who has been living pretty happily in Texas for these last 40 years.
Okay, well, I want to make sure the audience has an opportunity to ask a question or two.
Do you touch at all on like any of the battles of the Revolutionary War, like Saratoga or Yorktown or anything like that?
I do. So, because one of my main figures is George Washington, I have to, and I'm already inclined to, deal with the campaigns of the war. But if you simply open to page 1 of the book, you'll see I begin with the bitterest battles of the war, which were fought in the Southern theater. And the point I make here is, and this is definitely true of the war generally, that the nastiest fighting, the deepest hatreds, the most vicious combat, hand-to-hand, knife to the hilt, took place not between Americans and British, but between Americans and Americans. And this sort of displays a common feature of civil wars. When Americans fought against British, even more when they fought against Hessians, German mercenaries brought in, it wasn't personal. It was political. You're on the other side. But there wasn't a sense of betrayal. But when Americans fought against American, each side thought that the other had betrayed them. In the case of William Franklin, this comes out. It was ironic, and it was just mind-boggling to William Franklin and all the other loyalists. But William Franklin felt it particularly. William Franklin, and I choose my words carefully, nobody became a loyalist. You remained a loyalist. The people who became something else were the Patriots, the rebels. William Franklin was a loyal servant of King George. And there's every reason to believe that William Franklin was utterly sincere in his support for King George. He was as much an enthusiast of the British Empire as his father was. But where his father had this personal experience that caused him to change his mind, William Franklin had no such personal experience. And he saw no reason to change his mind. But what happened to him was the big history changed on him. And so although he did not take any action that would be construed as treason, he was nonetheless accused and imprisoned for treason, not because of anything that he did, but for what he didn't do. Essentially, what happened was that New Jersey declared independence as part of the Declaration of Independence, and all of a sudden they wrote a new constitution and a whole new set of laws and required people to swear loyalty to this new government and to abjure loyalty to Britain. And individuals who did not, especially if you happen to be governor of the colony, province, now state, you were imprisoned. And so ordinarily, a big crime like treason, in fact, in many people's reckoning, there's no crime worse than treason. It's sort of like it can entail murder on a grand scale. You're taking up arms against your country. William Franklin didn't do that. It's just that his country changed on him. So treason is ordinarily a crime of commission. You do something. But for the Loyalists, treason was construed as a crime of omission. They didn't flip their loyalties. And so with William Franklin, and so on all sides, there was this sense of betrayal. And it gave rise to, and actually I have a chapter on one of the things that William Franklin did after he got out of the prison that he was cast into. And he became the leader of what amounted to a guerrilla army of Loyalists who would launch raids. So he was based in New York City, which was the epicenter of Loyalism in America during the Revolutionary War. And his people, Franklin's people, William Franklin's people, would stage raids and reprisals into New Jersey and attack Patriot militias and members of the Continental Army. So there was this sort of guerrilla war that was going on amid the larger war. So yes, I do deal with that stuff.
I just have a question regarding your research and Galloway and his wife come to mind after reading your book. Aside from the big names in the book like Franklin and Adams and Washington, was there a piece of evidence that you uncovered in your research that was lesser known or not known to you that was really surprising or shocking that changed your view on the relationship of Patriots and Loyalists? Yeah.
I did find new stuff that was new to me. I'm going to bet it's new to you. I won't say that it was shocking to me because I've been doing history long enough my threshold for shock is pretty high, so I don't get shocked easily. So two of the individuals that I described were two slaves, people who were working for masters at the time the Revolutionary War broke out. One was a man named Boston King, and he lived and worked on a plantation in South Carolina. The other was a slave in Connecticut. His name was Jeffrey Brace. And both of them heard an announcement that the British government made even before the Declaration of Independence was signed. In 1775, the British governor of Virginia, a man named Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation. This was after the fighting began at Lexington and Concord. So the Patriots are already fighting against the British. And Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation. It was the Revolutionary War's equivalent of the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. But it was a little bit more restricted. What it said was that any slave of a rebel master who will leave the service of his master and join the British Army will be guaranteed freedom for doing so. And so this was a promise that got the attention of slaves all across the country. And precisely because it did, masters made their best efforts to keep this quiet. So nobody knew about this story. By the way, Gleaves is very familiar with the holiday Juneteenth, which was the day, June 19th, on which the Emancipation Proclamation was finally announced in Texas in the Civil War. But the striking thing is, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. Juneteenth refers to June 19th, 1865. And so the word can be suppressed, that potentially you're free. Anyway, so Boston King hears about this. He says, okay, should I take up this offer? And he had to think about it a while, because just as everybody who made a choice between independence and loyalism has to weigh various factors in that decision. So how risky is this? Am I going to get killed? Am I, as Benjamin Franklin alluded to, in saying we all have to hang together or we'll hang separately, they were committing treason against the British Crown. And that was a capital offense. So if Boston King decided to take up the British offer, he would have to ask himself, can I actually escape from the plantation? Can I make it to the British lines? Can I cross the lines and make it to the British camp? Will they actually honor their promise? What happens if they lose? Am I going to be protected? What happens if they win? Are they going to follow through? Boston King ultimately decided, yeah, I'm going to take up the offer. So he fought in the British Army against his master and against the other patriots. He traveled around the Southern Theater. He was on board ships for a while. He wound up, after the fighting in the South wound down, he wound up in New York City. And he was part of that large group of refugees who fled America at the end of the war. This included all the British soldiers, all the British seamen, and also all the loyalists who could find room on British ships, because they had to get out of there too. And I'll just digress here briefly to say, a question, a chestnut that historians have debated for years and years is, how revolutionary really was the American Revolution? Was the American Revolution as revolutionary as the French Revolution? As the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution? And there's often a view that no, it wasn't that revolutionary. And one of the ways you sort of measure the revolutionary effect of something is how much blood gets spilled. And the answer in the American Revolution was not really all that much. It's useful to remember that the scale of the battles in the American Revolution was quite modest. George Washington's Continental Army never had more than 12 to 14,000 men under arms. You know, this is small potatoes compared to that other Civil War of the 1860s. But, you know, so this is something where everybody has to sort of figure out what the risks involved are. And so when the Loyalists are fleeing and they're going away, Boston King manages to leave with them. Oh, and so to get back to this question of how revolutionary was the American Revolution, it's often seen as not that revolutionary because there's not that much blood left over at the end of the war. There's nothing like the French Terror and the latter part of the French Revolution. But there's a reason for this, and it doesn't have to do with the ideology of the revolution. It has to do with the fact that there was an exit strategy for the Loyalists. They could leave, and the people on the losing side, they're gone. Whereas in France, the people who are on the wrong side of the French Revolution, there was almost no place for them to go. And the same thing was true with the Russian Revolution. Yeah, there are a few wealthy aristocrats who can leave. But for the most part, they're stuck there and they have to deal with the aftermath of being on the wrong side of the war. So, anyway, Boston King manages to escape and he goes to Canada. And from Canada, he eventually moves, and as a free man. So the British do fulfill their promise. He goes from Canada to Britain. He finally winds up in Sierra Leone. in West Africa. This was a colony. There was the British version of Liberia, a place where former slaves go back to their ancestral homeland. So he's one of the people that I look at. And his story is, I hadn't known about his story before I started doing this. There was the other slave, his Patriot counterpart, was named Jeffrey Brace. And he did not, he either didn't have as good an opportunity to take up the British offer, or he thought that the risks were too high, but he wound up going to war on the Patriot side because his master went to war and he was his master's servant, so he goes to war too. Now, Jeffrey Brace understood the irony of it. In fact, one of the reasons I can tell the story of these two is that they both wrote memoirs. And Jeffrey Brace reflected after the fact on, he understood that, okay, if the side that I'm fighting for wins, this will further tighten the shackles on me because emancipation was not in the cards at the moment. It was not part of the war agenda of the Patriot side. However, in his case, he fought gallantly, bravely, effectively during the war. And at the end of the war, his master said, "You've done very well. I give you your freedom." So those are some stories that I wasn't aware of. I profile a leader of the Mohawk tribe of the Iroquois Confederacy, a man named Joseph Brant. I had encountered Brant previously, but I had not had occasion to follow this story through. In the case of the Native American peoples, they had to make a decision. So which side do you like? So there's a personal connection. There was a personal connection for Brant. Which side do you think is going to win? If this side wins, if that side wins, what are the prospects for your people? And so Brant made a decision for the Mohawks to stick with the British. They knew the British were a known quantity. The Americans were a known quantity too, but what the Mohawks feared was, if the Americans win, there will be no restraining them, and they'll take all of our lands right away. But not all of the Mohawks followed Joseph Brant. So the war split the Mohawk tribe. And furthermore, it split the Iroquois Confederacy. So this was true of all of the Indians. You mentioned Joseph Galloway. So I had known about Joseph Galloway. I didn't know the story of his wife, Grace Galloway. And the reason I was able to find her story was that she also kept a diary of what happened to her. And just very briefly, Joseph Galloway was a contemporary, an associate, a friend of Benjamin Franklin in Pennsylvania politics before the American Revolution. But where Franklin finally concluded, in part because of that personal experience he had, that the empire was too corrupt and wasn't worth saving. Galloway said, it's not that bad. We can fix the things that are wrong. So he remained a loyalist. And he was riding high, literally riding high, when the British Army occupied Philadelphia. This was his home. So the British occupied Philadelphia during the winter that George Washington and the Continental Army spent at Valley Forge. That's why they were at Valley Forge, sort of keeping an eye on the British in Philadelphia. And Joseph Galloway ingratiated himself to the British High Command. It was Joseph Galloway that persuaded the British to carry the war to the South. Because, said Galloway, there are a lot of loyalists in the South, and you can encourage them by coming south. Turned out to be bad advice. But when the British left Philadelphia, Joseph Galloway left with them because he knew that, well, the Patriots and the Continental Army are coming back, and everybody will know that I supported the enemy. So Joseph Galloway left for England, and he took his daughter, the only child of Joseph Galloway and his wife, Grace. He left Grace behind because, well, in part because Grace brought a lot of property to the marriage. And also because Joseph Galloway, and maybe Grace went along with this reasoning, she would be less likely to be subjected to reprisal for something her husband did. Okay, women were kind of stuck with their husbands, and they weren't always blamed for what their husbands did. So Grace remained behind. But she soon discovered that being left behind amounted to being abandoned, that she lost touch with her husband. Her husband persuaded her, at least enough for her to go along with, that their daughter, who was about 16 years old at the time, would be safer in England, and she could get an education, she could make a future there that she would never be able to make in America. So Grace Galloway is left behind, and she has to fend for herself. She has to deal with the legal system of reoccupied Philadelphia. And in this capacity, she encounters repeatedly the American officer who's placed in command of Philadelphia, a man named Benedict Arnold. And so she gets to know Arnold. And Arnold is actually, he seems to be a nice enough guy, and his heart seems to be in the right place, but he can't, or he won't, protect Grace against the Patriots now, who are going to expropriate the property. And Grace finds herself homeless. She discovers that she doesn't have an income because the savings that her husband left behind, they've been confiscated too. And she finds herself friendless because once the British Army has left, all the people who declared themselves loyalists while the British Army was there, they're scarce, and they're keeping their heads down. And so now she is treated as this enemy. She finds that people that she had known for years and considered friends, they won't speak to her. Worse than that, they will spy on her. They will tell the new authorities, the Patriots who are now governing Philadelphia, that there is this loyalist person, this Grace Galloway, and we better watch her. So Grace Galloway discovered that the walls had ears, and she couldn't speak honestly with anybody. But ironically here, having been abandoned by her husband, finding herself in dire straits, she found in herself something she hadn't suspected. She came to realize that she liked being separated from her husband. Her husband had been kind of overbearing, and she hadn't known any better. And she, in her diary, she writes this, and there's no reason to think that she's writing with snooping people like me centuries later to come along. And she talks about how, in her loyalty to the king, she has found freedom from her husband and freedom from the expectations that she grew up with. Now, I'm not going to tell you the end of the Grace Galloway story, it would spoil things, but yeah, so these are some of the things that I discovered that I really didn't know about before I went into this.
H.W. Brands, Bill, thank you so much for these poignant stories, for continuing our conversation here in West Michigan. We're going to have you back for your next book, which I got a little preview of earlier today. It'll be also a very compelling work, but your insights and your ability to take what could be the abstractions of big history and bring them to the human heart is just extraordinary. Thank you so much. Give me a hand.
Thank you, Gleaves.